Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this Agora Energiewende webinar, Investing in the Green Deal. My name is Kai Samral. I'm President EU Communications Lead at Agora Think Tanks. I will be moderating today's event. Why are we having the event today? Oh, it's very exciting times in the EU policy-making cycles. The commissioner hearings are wrapping up and the new commission will soon take office. Also, we cannot have noticed the drama of the last week, but regardless of everything, the transition to net zero is well on its way across the world. Now, for the EU, one of the key tasks in the new policy cycle is to implement the Green Deal. And this is essential to ensure a robust path towards climate neutrality while advancing competitiveness, solidarity, and sovereignty. Now, this will require significant investments. Most of these investments will come from private sources, but public funding plays an important role in triggering them. Against this background, we are delighted to discuss with you today two recent Agora publications. The first one analyzes the macroeconomic impacts of ambitious climate action, both for the EU as a whole and for 5 of its biggest member states, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and Poland. A separate policy paper then outlines how public funding can help unlock the necessary private investments and overcome the so-called climate funding cliff, which is looming after the EU's recovery fund ends in 2026. Now, I'm not going to go deeper into these publications, but I will let my colleague give you the juicy insights. About the agenda, we will first hear an introduction by Frauke Thies, who is Executive Director of Agora Think Tanks. The introductory remarks are then followed by a presentation by my colleague Christopher Schroeder, one of the authors of these papers. Then we were supposed to have a commentary by an esteemed guest, Ms. Margret Stratzenstaller, but I'm afraid I need to inform you that she had to cancel her participation at the last minute. In any case, at the end of the presentation, we will be happy to take your questions. Now, without further ado, I hand over to Frauke Thies, Executive Director, Agora Think Tanks.
Thank you very much, Kaisa, and a warm welcome also from me to this Agora Energiewende webinar on investing in the Green Deal. And I appreciate that we had to move the webinar from when we had initially planned it in September, and we are really grateful for your understanding and also all the more for your presence in today's webinar. And I'm really delighted to open this session today, where my colleagues, in particular Christopher, will be presenting insights from 2 of our recent reports, as Kaisa already pointed out, delving into how we can fund Europe's transition to climate neutrality. Now, as we look ahead to the policy cycle that is just starting, there is broad agreement, of course, that climate action is and remains an integral part of Europe's strategic goals, which span from security through sustained prosperity to global competitiveness. And the Draghi report very much reinforces this, stressing that Europe's competitiveness must evolve hand in hand with our path to climate neutrality. And of course, delivering on Europe's climate neutrality objective is critical also to deliver on the Global Paris Agreement. And especially now in these challenging times, showcasing climate leadership is so very crucial. And I think it's clear that finance will play an essential role in making this necessary transformation of our economy succeed. Now, as Kaisa already indicated, this transition towards climate neutrality demands significant increases both in the public as well as in the private investment side. Something that we haven't seen in this order of magnitude since the 1970s and 80s. What our research indicates is that in the EU, we'll need at least an additional 460 billion euros annually to support clean technologies, to transform Europe's industrial base, and to expand energy infrastructure that is fit for a net zero future. And much of this investment will have to come from private sources, but public funds will play a role in driving the momentum and leveraging the investments that we need. But it's very important that we don't view this transformation only from a cost perspective. And I think that's the encouraging news, that this kind of investment push towards the decarbonization of the economy is not only feasible, but it also brings substantial macroeconomic benefits. And this is actually one of the key findings of the first report that Christopher is presenting today, which is a macroeconomic modeling study that we conducted with Oxford Econometrics, and which illustrates how decarbonization can drive both growth and enhance competitiveness, which obviously also the Draghi report calls for. And then our second report, as Kaisa already indicated, addresses a very critical challenge that I believe all of us here are quite aware of. And that is that the EU budget has been a major contributor to public climate investment in Europe until now. But the recovery fund is ending and new fiscal rules are approaching, which mean that member states could soon face a climate funding cliff. And Chris will further go into what we mean by this funding cliff later on. So this second report outlines both short-term and medium-term solutions to bridging this gap of the funding cliff, ensuring that the EU budget continues to play the vital role that it has to play in supporting climate investments. So if we look at it in essence, our work shows that it's possible and desirable for Europe to scale up climate investments, while we can at the same time, and we need to, preserve the sustainability of public debt and the functioning of the single market. And obviously, this very climate action we're talking about here is integral to creating a just society and fostering economic security. So it is crucial that we get this right. And we look forward to exchanging with you on these important issues and to advance our shared commitment to a sustainable and a climate neutral Europe. Thanks very much. And on that, I hand back to Kaisa, who will lead us through the conversation today.
Thank you for your remarks, Frauke. I would now like to introduce you indeed to my colleague, Christopher Schröder. Christopher is project officer working on EU green economy at Agora Energiewende, and he will talk you through these key findings of the two recent publications. Over to you, Chris.
Many thanks, Kaisa, and many thanks, Frauke, for the nice introduction. So I will first share the screen and see if everything worked. Looks good to me. Yeah, welcome again, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm very delighted to actually be presenting not only one, but two Agora publications today. And also my best wishes go out to Margit, who cannot be here today. Last time it was me who's fallen sick, so I can relate. But we will move ahead nonetheless today. Let me also say a few words on the overall context or the motivation of the study, of both studies that I'm going to be presenting today. So, yeah, as we all know, we are entering a new legislative cycle in the EU. The new commission is about to take office. If we think about this period 5 years ago for the previous commission, the context was quite different, to say the least. For those who have been around, there was a huge momentum for globally, a huge momentum for climate policy, out of which the Green Deal was born, the major flagship project of the previous commission, with the ultimate goal to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. Now, a lot of things have happened and it feels a bit of a different age, but many major legislative pieces have been adopted. And despite more challenging environments, we need to press ahead with the implementation of the Green Deal and make it a success. And also in the new commission, we will adopt a new climate target for 2040, most likely hovering around 90% of emission reductions. And this is actually in line with our own modeling, the GEXIT modeling that we have published, a techno-economic modeling study that you can see here on the screen, which really showcases the magnitude of the challenge when it comes to emission reductions. And our modeling also calls for roughly 90% emission reduction in 2040. So there's a huge effort that we need to make. And carbon pricing will be important, regulation will be important, but above all, also boosting investments to new heights, maybe last seen in the 70s or 80s, will be needed in order to reach climate neutrality in the upcoming period to implement Green Deal legislation. So we need to talk more about investments, and investment needs should not only be regarded as costs, but also that we should acknowledge that they bring about a huge structural change in the economy, and we need to better understand that. So that's kind of the motivation of our two studies, that in the first one, we have a macro modeling exercise to look at the macroeconomic impacts of the EU economy moving towards climate neutrality and of the investment push that is needed. And spoiler alert, the macroeconomic outcome is broadly positive. So then in the second step, there's a question, how can we achieve unleashing the investment wave that we need to unleash? And the second paper is a more policy-oriented paper that looks at some solutions, how the EU can play a significant role in climate funding. But let me start with the macro modeling study, and I know not many of you are economists, so I try to be as accessible as possible. But you can always ask more technical questions later on. So essentially, we have two major questions. How will the EU economy be affected by the green transition? And how will public budgets be affected, or debt levels be affected by the transition and the investment wave that we need to unleash? And then you can have a look at various indicators that answer these questions, of course. And our approach in this modeling exercise is that we collaborated with Oxford Economics, a very well-known economic consultancy, to model the climate neutrality pathway of Grexit. And we look at 5 member states, important economies: France, Germany, Italy, Poland, and Spain, and the EU as a whole. And we also look at 3 different policy scenarios to explore different policy mixes. And I'm not going to go into detail too much on the methodological approaches, but I think maybe 2 things would be interesting to know for you. First, we use the outputs of our Grexit study that I mentioned earlier, the techno-economic modeling study, and use them as inputs to feed in the macroeconomic model that we use from Oxford Economics. And this has the advantage that we have much more precise inputs when it comes to investment needs, electrification rates, than many macroeconomic models use. So it's more precise in that sense. A second thing you want to know is that the macroeconomic model from Oxford Economics does not only look at carbon pricing as a cost, but also at the investments that it incentivizes. Because of course, carbon pricing triggers investments in low carbon solutions as well. And these are accounted for in this model. And this is maybe all you want to know now. Of course, you also have to make some assumptions on carbon pricing, like in every modeling exercise. But let's say a few words on the 3 policy scenarios I mentioned earlier. They have different policy mixes, but all achieve the exact same emission reduction pathway you can see on the right chart. So the notion is you can achieve the same outcome with different policy mixes. And we compared it to a baseline scenario. That is the turquoise line. And you can see that the baseline scenario also experiences emission reduction. So the baseline scenario is not a no action scenario, but rather a model through type scenario. Now, looking at the 3 different policy scenarios, just a few quick points. We have the core scenario, the lower pricing scenario, and the conservative policy scenario. Important to know is that in the lower pricing scenario, we redistribute all carbon revenues back to households, 100%. In the other 2 scenarios, it's only a third that is redistributed back, or recycled, as we say. Then in the lower pricing scenario, you also have a much higher public financial support, 10 percentage points higher. And in the conservative policy scenario, in turn, we adopt a budget neutral approach, which means that all additional climate spending is offset by extra budget cuts in other areas, austerity, essentially. And then we can talk about the monetary policy assumptions. I'm not going to go into detail here, but it's not as important for our purposes. So let's dive into the findings. I cannot show you all the findings, so I recommend having a look for the interested person, but I'm gonna answer the two questions with two stories. How is the economy affected, and how are public budgets affected? So how is the economy in the EU affected by the pathway towards climate neutrality, the Grexit pathway? Here we can look at the year 2040 with a reduction of roughly 90% of emissions. And we have 5 different macroeconomic indicators that tell you something about the state of the economy. And we have all 3 policy scenarios, and we have all countries that we look at, and the European Union as a whole for each indicator for the year 2040. Also important to know is that the bars are deviations from the baseline. So the first thing that comes to mind here is, okay, there is really a positive growth story. If you look at GDP in real terms, in every scenario, in every member state, and the European Union as a whole, the GDP will be higher than in the baseline scenario. So achieving climate targets induces, for instance, at least a 2% higher GDP in the core scenario for the entire European Union. Now, what else can we say about here? We can talk about a few things that are interesting stories, but one I want to talk about is the case of Poland. Poland and the transition in Poland is really an economic success story. And this might be surprising because its economy is much more carbon intense than many others. And if you look at all the indicators that I marked, you can see it's winning across the board. Consumption in the lower pricing scenario especially is much higher, 6% than in the baseline. GDP is up to 6% higher than in the baseline. And borrowing costs are also much lower than in the baseline. That is the last indicator. And this is largely explained by an expansion in the manufacturing sector, in clean manufacturing, driven by huge investments. And you can see that in the gross value added in manufacturing in real terms as well. So this is an interesting story that we should talk more about, the potential Poland holds in the transition. And having said that, I'm going to move to the second point. How are public budgets affected according to this analysis? And we see here the public debt levels developing over time all the way until 2050 for the European Union and for 4 member states, for all scenarios and the baseline scenario. So Poland is not depicted here because in any case, that ratio is really declining sharply, and at the moment it's only at, I think, 44%. So it's not super relevant for this discussion. But looking at the European Union, what can we see? We can see that the transition achieves to reduce debt levels as well, while achieving climate targets, while unleashing investments in all scenarios in the beginning. And this is largely because of the positive growth effect of investments. Tax revenues will rise, GDP will grow, so the debt to GDP ratios will fall. And this is true across the board until the mid-30s. And then we can observe a more mixed picture because the investment wave or the effects of investments will slowly taper off. And then only some countries will experience stagnating public debt levels, such as France. Others will experience a slower decline in debt levels, such as Germany. And then there are special cases like Italy and Spain, where you see the trend reversing and public debt levels increasing again. Now you may ask, okay, but I can also see some lines going down. That's very right. And that's first the baseline, that's the purple one, and the conservative policy scenario that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But first, let's talk about why the public debt is rising again for Italy and Spain. First, because like for all the other countries, the positive investment effects are tapering off. And then second, they face higher borrowing costs than other countries, which weighs on their public budgets. And there are some other reasons, of course, but one major one to point out is the decline in fossil fuel tax revenues. And this is something that is not so much talked about so far, and we want to raise awareness here that as the transition progresses, you of course have higher you have lower use of fossil fuels, and that is desired. You want to have the decline in fossil fuel use, but you also have the decline in the revenues that you make from taxing this fossil fuel use. And this will, in most countries, eventually even offset the carbon pricing revenues. And in some cases, like Italy and Spain, fossil fuel tax revenues currently really constitute important element of their public budgets. So this is a risk that we need to address, and we need to find new sources of revenue to anticipate this fossil fuel tax revenue decline. This is one lesson. Another lesson is, of course, that if you were to comply with fiscal rules, this is not possible under two scenarios. For Italy and Spain, you can see the dotted line is the debt reduction path that they would have to embark on to comply with fiscal rules, essentially. So, but it is technically possible if you look at the conservative policy scenario, right? You can see if you cut budgets in other areas, then it is technically possible to finance the climate transition. However, and this is something that models cannot capture, there are some political, social, and economic risks that drag on growth as well if you impose such level of austerity. So while you could do it, the question is whether you should do it, not least for the public acceptance of the transition. If financing the climate transition is perceived to be the reason for austerity, I think it won't go so well with the public in countries like Italy and Spain. And that is kind of like the loop I want to close here, or the link I want to do to the next paper, because I'm in the end of my first presentation. We need to think about or keep pushing to ask the question whether we can introduce flexibilities in fiscal rules, how we can find new revenue sources, and how we can strengthen the role of EU-level climate funding, also to help special cases like Italy and Spain, but also across the board to support common European public goods. And the next paper is going to look more closely on some solutions. But I think there was already quite a lot of input, and maybe we want to have a quick 1 minute breathing pause. We can stand up, open the window, and just think about something else for a minute, and I will be silent for a minute, and then we can reconvene, hopefully with enough in the tank for another presentation. All right, I hope you had your moment. So let's dive into the next publication. This is a more policy-oriented publication on the role of the EU in climate funding and the future of it. And for that, because I was talking about investment, but I didn't really specify what is the actual investment challenge, let me give you an overview of the challenge and of the role of the EU that it has played so far. As Frauke mentioned also in her introduction, 460 billion euros a year at least will be needed for the energy transition every year. This is both public and private money, and public funding, the share of public funding varies across sectors. It varies also across member states, but overall it makes up roughly a third of total spending. And on the left chart, you can see the sectoral relative composition of the climate investment needs in the EU that we model. So you can see that the major bulk of public funding will be needed in the building sector, in transport infrastructure, power grids, infrastructure. And this was roughly 1% of EU GDP, or 170 billion euros in 23 prices. Now, bear in mind, this doesn't cover agriculture, biodiversity targets, land use sectors, or climate change adaptation, which are all very important spending areas, but beyond the scope of this paper, even though people should look at that in the future as well. We focus on the energy transition in a narrow sense, and also this doesn't include clean tech manufacturing support, but I will talk about that later and what we propose for that. So far, to the public spending. A third of total spending must be public. And what has the EU delivered so far? If you look at the various budget items of the current EU budget, if you count all the contributions together, it's 390 billion euros in grants of relevant climate funding. 390 billion euros, or a third of the public spending gap. So a third of all investment needs must be public, and a third of the public spending gap was covered so far by EU climate funding. And this chart here shows an even more differentiated picture. It shows the different spending gaps across member states and the different degrees to which the EU covers these public spending gaps. You can see that countries with more spending needs relatively and less fiscal power have tended to have benefited more from EU climate funding. And so the EU has played a quite substantial role in climate funding in the EU. But if we look into the future, we see what we call a climate funding cliff looming for three major reasons. First, Next Generation EU, of which the Recovery Fund was the major element, the response to the COVID crisis, was financed with debt, with common EU debt, and the repayment of this debt is not yet secured. The Commission have proposed a package of new own resources to finance the repayment of debt, and it would be sufficient to repay the debt, but there hasn't been an agreement with the member states on that. And as long as there's no agreement on that, there will be the uncertainty, and the question of debt repayment will be looming over the next EU budget negotiations and the amount of climate funding available. Then secondly, the Recovery Fund will expire or discontinue by the end of 26. And the Recovery Fund, as you can also see in the chart, has made a substantial contribution to EU climate funding, 40% of all EU climate funding, 10% of overall public spending, gap coverage has been done by the Recovery Fund. So when it finishes operating, it will leave a net funding hole of 170 billion euros. And then we have the new fiscal rules that require debt reduction, debt consolidation for member states that together account for 40% of all EU emissions. So very not neglectable amount of member states that will face additional fiscal constraints. So what can we do about it? What are our policy recommendations? We have two dimensions of policy recommendations: how to increase the quality and how to essentially increase or ensure the right quantity for EU climate funding. So when it comes to increasing the quality, we mean increasing the impact of EU climate funding, of course, and there have been many points of criticism raised. Most of them are valid when it comes to the quality of EU climate funding. Some of them can also be made for public, for member state public funding, of course, but focusing on the EU, there have been issues such as slow absorption of EU funds, transparency issues, effectiveness issues, doubts about the climate mainstreaming approach, and so on and so forth. What we propose is kind of one single solution that could have an effect on all the other points. By removing a major barrier of lacking information. We still have not enough information on a member states level. What are the actual climate investment needs, and what is their actual nature? So we propose to have member states conduct climate investment needs assessments on a member state level based on a common methodology, and in a second step, develop climate financing strategies that are informed by these assessments and that will inform also the structuring of the EU budget. This will overall improve the coordination, the steering of investments, and the effectiveness of the allocation of funds to be flowing in the right places. And that's all I'm going to say about quality here because we have time constraints. So let me focus on the quantity part. We have both short-term solutions and medium-term solutions, meaning for the next budget cycle. So let me say a few words on the two short-term solutions. Short-term meaning here the next 3 years before the next EU budget kicks in. First, we propose establishing a front-loading mechanism of national ETS2 revenues. And second, we recommend to replenish the InvestEU program in the short term. So why do we want to front-load national ETS2 revenues? As you know, the ETS2 is a novel carbon pricing mechanism that directly for the first time targets households and vulnerable households. And it's important to moderate the carbon pricing development for the public acceptance of the ETS2 mechanism and also for the need for reducing the need for compensation payments in the future. It is important to have front-loaded investments in clean heating mobility solutions so that households and companies can reduce their exposure to carbon pricing before it fully kicks in. And this is acknowledged, the need to front-load investments is acknowledged by the EU. They have set up the Social Climate Fund, and we believe there is room to reinforce that front-loading element of the Social Climate Fund with more front-loading, setting up a mechanism that is on a voluntary basis, can front-load national ETS2 revenues, and very conservatively generate at least 36 billion euros in the next 3 years to be invested in ETS2 sectors. And effectively, the benefit would be that this front would not show up in national accounts, so it would not count to national budget deficits, giving member states a bit more breathing space and allowing them to have a bit more investments. Second short-term solution, as I said, the InvestEU is a unique mechanism that uses a budget guarantee from the EU budget to leverage private finance in collaboration with the EIB and other financial implementing partners. So it's leveraging private finance with a EU budget guarantee, and this guarantee is soon depleted, and we recommend to replenish it for the InvestEU program to operate until the end of this budget cycle. Where could we find the money to prop up InvestEU? And we recommend repurposing a small amount of funds from other funds that have problems to use all their spending. There is this flexibility under the so-called member state compartment that could provide for 7 billion euros that then would make up a roughly 22 billion euros guarantee that could then trigger ideally a lot of private additional investments. So we make the case to repurpose a bit of the funds that otherwise would maybe not be spent. It is important to note that some funds, cohesion funds, recovery funds, have problem to spend their money fully. But if the money is not spent until certain deadlines, the money kind of evaporates and will not be spent. So it's important to spend it. And one way would be to shift a small amount to InvestEU. It's just part of the solution. What is the use case for where should the InvestEU operate? There's one particular use case for smaller scale clean tech manufacturers that currently face barriers for scaling up, market failures that could be mitigated with counter guarantees, a specific instrument that would make a great impact. And the EIB is already using it for the wind sector, for instance. And this would be a good use case that we recommend. So now the last slide, and then I release you into the Q&A session after summarizing, of course. But this is our call for a new fund in the new budget cycle, so starting in 28. Essentially a follow-up to the recovery fund when it comes to climate funding that we call Green Deal Implementation Fund, money made available to help the implementation of the Green Deal and to help bridge the funding cliff that I outlined in the beginning. We estimate 260 billion euros in grants over 7 years would be necessary And the objective is to maintain the EU co-financing share that I mentioned in the beginning, 1/3 of the public climate funding gap. So you can see that in the chart that with our new fund, the 1/3 of the public spending gap would be continued to be covered by the EU. You can see here that the national public spending gap is a bit higher. That is because we account for clean tech manufacturing support, and the overall investment needs are a bit higher. So we want to make available 50 billion euros of this fund for clean tech, strategic clean tech manufacturing support. Other important areas are support investments in the residential sector, select infrastructure of various sorts. And then what is special also about our proposal is that we do not only call for a fund, but we also showcase how it can be financed. In our financing scenarios, I recommend having a look. We select various new own resources that are best suited to be adopted and can generate the required revenues for this fund. And we have different financing scenarios, one of which includes a small amount of debt, and which we showcase also with the debt repayment, interest payments, and so on, that it would be a feasible option and certainly also useful to stretch the financing burden over time, but it would not be the only option to finance the fund. So now I'm going to summarize the two papers in 4 large sentences, and then I'm looking forward to your questions. First, the EU can both reach ambitious climate targets and grow its economy. For instance, a 90% emission reduction by 2040 would at least achieve 2% of additional EU GDP growth. The transition in Poland is an economic success story. Italy and Spain, secondly, Italy and Spain are special cases that will need additional fiscal consolidation if they want to deliver both on climate goals and debt reduction goals in the long term. But beyond these two countries, most EU governments need to be aware of the decline in fossil fuel tax revenues. They cannot rely on carbon pricing revenues alone to finance their climate investments because they will be offset by this decline in fossil fuel tax revenues. This is why these findings call for more flexibility in fiscal rules, the examination of new revenue sources, and a stronger role of EU-level climate funding. Speaking of which, governments should identify national investment needs and develop accordingly financing strategies that will also inform the EU budget to most effectively allocate climate funding and remove the crucial information barrier that we currently face. And then fourthly and lastly, when it comes to the quantity of EU funding, in the short term, we can front load future ETS2 revenues, we can replenish the InvestEU, and in the new budget cycle as of 2028, we would need a new fund that could be part of a larger package. We could also call it competitiveness fund. It doesn't need to, the name doesn't matter as much, but it can be financed with a balanced mix of resources, and it would be 260 billion euros over 7 years. Having said that, thank you. And let's see if you have any questions.
Thank you, Chris, for this insightful presentation. I think that's the kind of good climate story that we also need and needs to get more attention, that ambitious action actually leads to also economic growth. And on the other hand, there's plenty of food for thought for policymakers above all, for both the immediate future and also in the lead up to the next EU budget cycle. Now, we have some questions for you, but I would like to encourage everyone to keep them coming. We still have time to answer them, but I will take on a first come, first served basis from the Q&A. So we have a few different questions from Thomas Knoll. First of all, he had a question about slide 11. What is the contribution of infrastructure setup on the public debt level? in slide 11.
Slide 11. Okay, yeah, the specific contribution when it comes to infrastructure cannot be seen on this graph. I would need to look that up in the data actually. But if you send me an email, I can certainly have a look and see what I can find to and send it your way.
And a couple of more questions. How much money of the EU budget is reserved for IPCEI projects?
We haven't fixated specific amount for IPCEI projects, but certainly they will need to play a more prominent role because there's a strong case in finding common ground, finding common projects that advance the EU causes such as green public goods. So it can be expected in any case that more IPCEIs will be used and should be used.
The last one on the more technical side, perhaps. So how much money did you consider for CCS and DAC, direct air capture?
That's a pertinent question, actually. I don't think we have incorporated that to a great extent. At this point, there's also very little data on that. But I would love to follow up with you, and if you could send me an email to discuss this further. I would have to look into the data, but the current data is very bleak or meek, or not a lot of data on these issues.
I think maybe you two would have a lot to discuss to follow up with this webinar. I will move on to the other questions. How do you assess the risk that front-loading ETS2 revenues could reduce prices and thus future effectiveness of that tool?
That's a good question, because I didn't go into the details as to how the mechanism would be set up, but it would be different actually to what you referred to, because we already front-loaded revenue for the Repower EU package, and there allowances from the future were sold in the present. So there were more allowances put on the market in the present, which of course, and that's what you're referring to, I think, suppressed the prices because there was more supply of allowances, which leads to overall less revenue. But the mechanism that we would foresee is that the EU establishes a facility that issues debt, EU common debt, a small amount, up to 36 billion. And the repayment of this debt will be secured by allowances from member states, but they will be sold in the future. So there is not this kind of market distortion taking place. Of course, there is some interest rate to pay, and we calculated really conservatively because you also don't know the price developments. I think we assumed a 30 euros price, and only a small amount of the overall allowances. So it's much more secure against kind of these sort of risks, fiscal risks.
Okay, and the next question would be, how are social sustainable aspects considered in this transition? What are the impacts on economic inequality?
So yeah, I mean,
coefficient, which I do not know.
I don't think I'm not sure whether we have the Gini coefficient in the data. To be honest, that would be very interesting. The extent to which we look also at equity issues is, of course, the redistribution of carbon pricing revenues. In the lower pricing scenario, we have 100% of redistribution that, of course, would then come they would be redistributed, so they would benefit vulnerable households. That would be a huge measure to be considered. So if you look at the lower pricing scenario, you can see how a much more socially equitable scenario would look like. And you can see it would work. Of course, it has some effects on debt levels and others, but it is one of the technically possible scenarios. Other dimensions, I mean, the front loading of ETS2 revenues is essentially also to to moderate the ETS2 carbon price development in the future, so that vulnerable households won't be even affected as much in the future if you front load investments now. So that's also kind of an angle here. But of course, besides these redistribution of carbon revenues, the focus of the study is not so much on these kind of issues, but worthwhile to note.
All right. So next, I would be really curious to hear from you. The talk in the town is, of course, competitiveness and how we need more funding for it. Now, von der Leyen has also announced that she will put forward the competitiveness fund. Do you have any views on that?
Yes, so far what we know, I think, to my knowledge, there is not enough detailed knowledge as to how the competitiveness fund would be structured. I understand that the idea is to merge pre-existing funds for innovation, such as the Innovation Fund, the European Innovation Council, InvestEU, and others, and merging these funds to have one fund with a single rule book, I think, is a good idea. It's also in line with our thinking. We also propose to merge some off-budget funds in the future with our fund proposal, because we have the problem of a fragmented funding landscape. And if you have the option to merge funds and make it more efficient, that's welcome. But that would only address the quality question. But we also need to talk about the quantity question, and it's really not known whether this competitiveness fund will see any raises in additional funding, or whether it will be just pre-existing funding, such as the STEP exercise, and it will be just a repackaging. That won't be enough. We need also the adequate funding quantity. And this is still to be seen how it will play out. And I think this whole process is tied to the Clean Industrial Deal and to the budget discussion more broadly. So it would be something to follow.
Okay, then maybe one question on how to make sure that the funding goes exactly where it is needed. If you have any views on that, there's also been some news recently about concerns that the EU level funding is not necessarily used in projects where they would make the biggest difference.
Yeah, it's a complex question, because it really always depends on the very fund and the very situation. But there are some reoccurring themes, of course, when it comes to these challenges. And we just say, if we had an investment plan that is based on a sound analysis, on a common methodology, you at least know where should the money flow. And if you had this kind of like top-down knowledge, it would be already much more easy to allocate it to the right places. Then there are more technical questions as to the governance of these funds. And I don't think that we only need performance-based governance approaches. They will help and they will be needed, but of course, a mix is of bottom-up governments and top-down governments is the best way to approach the transition. I don't think we should abolish cohesion policy completely. The partnership principle has its benefits, but of course also in cohesion policy there must be some reforms and more performance-based approaches.
Thank you, Chris. I am looking at the Q&A and I don't see new ones that I haven't covered yet. This would be the last chance to put a question in if you still have them. Otherwise, of course, always welcome to follow up with Chris afterwards.
Maybe one point on the equality part, just to follow up. I mean, we also looked at employment and saw broadly positive employment outcomes, and that you can look up in the study. That's of course also part of equality questions. I just wanted to add that.
There is one more question coming in response to my last call. So how could a combination of bottom-up and top-down look like in cohesion policies, in your view?
I mean, yeah, governance is always complicated. But I know that cohesion policy, some programs have already some performance-based elements, and I've seen the Commission thinking that thinks about merging all cohesion policy funds, all funds effectively under so-called shared management into one single plan, national plans for each member states, where you have different chapters. Then you may have an energy chapter and other chapters, but that would be a quite radical approach if it would be all performance-based, but maybe there is a middle ground of having plans, but also some funds that remain that or that are tied to the plans that are still governed under the partnership principle. But I think it's a very technical question that need to be really evaluated properly in the various circumstances.
Right. Well, I see one more question here. Not sure if this is something you can answer, but let's just put it out there. How do you rate the bottlenecks of the H2 value chain for being successful at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, in general, it's important to match both supply and demand. That's our line of thinking, of course. I mean, you already did this through EU auctions on the one side and requirements on the other side of the equation. But of course, more could and should be done, especially on the demand side. For instance, scaling up lead markets, where we also published a paper on the nature of lead markets. I think that's all I can say so far.
There you go. Thank you very much. Let's see. Now doesn't seem like we have more questions. Thank you. I would like to warmly thank you, especially Chris, carrying this webinar today on your own. Very interesting. And also everyone behind the scenes here who made it work smoothly. And of course, our audience. It's good to see that so many people could make it, even with the change of dates, change in program. So many thanks on my side.